Our last item on the agenda is item 3, and this is the audit of neighborhood planning. Let me also just say I've closed down my speaker system, so I'd have a little more room here. So if anybody does come in, I don't have anybody signed up to speak on this or any other items, but again, if you are here to speak and want to, just please get my attention so that we can recognize you at the appropriate time. Welcome.
Excellent. In a somewhat rare circumstance, the Assistant City Auditor or Manager of this project is Walt Persons, and it's also his birthday today, so I want to recognize that. Doesn't happen very often that you get to present to the
No singing.
City Council Audit and Finance Committee on your birthday. Yes, no singing.
Welcome.
I do not plan to
birthday.
sing.
Thank you.
So in addition to Walt, the auditor in charge on this project was Michael McGill. And before Walt begins, I want to provide just a little bit of context. Neighborhood plans adopted in the first 15 years of neighborhood planning amended the city's 1979 comprehensive plan. In more recent years, the city adopted a new comprehensive plan and, as you know, moved to from an at-large council to one with council members representing geographic districts. With that in mind, we conducted this audit. It looked at how the cities manage communication and governance for neighborhood planning, as well as alignment with the current comprehensive plan. So with that, Walt will make our presentation.
Thank you, Corey. Good morning, Mayor Pro Tem and council members. Let's see if I can, there we go. All right. In 1997, City Council formally initiated our current neighborhood planning efforts. The first neighborhood plan was adopted the following year in August 1998. 30 neighborhood plans are in place today. They generally contain high-level goals plus specific recommendations for land use, transportation, parks, and other area improvements. Most of the plans include a future land use map, which informs binding land use regulations. And each of the neighborhood plans is attached to and part of the Imagine Austin Comprehensive Plan. Neighborhood plan contact teams are made up of volunteers who advocate for their neighborhood plan. The contact teams are initiated by the city's Planning and Zoning Department after council adopts a neighborhood plan. There are 32 contact teams today. Not all plans have a contact team, and some plans have more than one. As Corey said, this audit had two objectives: to determine whether the city's communication and governance structures are effective in supporting neighborhood planning efforts, and to determine whether neighborhood planning efforts align with Imagine Austin. This audit has 4 findings. The first is regarding the development of neighborhood plans. We have a finding regarding neighborhood plan contact teams, the plans themselves, and certain fair housing implications. We'll expand upon these in our presentation, beginning now with our first finding. And our first finding is that the current state of Austin's neighborhood planning efforts, where portions of the city have plans and others do not, can result in inequitable land use treatment. The map included with this slide shows in blue the areas of Austin with established neighborhood plans. Austin's 30 neighborhood plans cover 26% of the city's incorporated area, and about 45% of the city's population lives in these areas. The yellow on the map indicates planned areas and future planning areas, I should say, and the red indicates areas where neighborhood planning has been suspended. The gray is the city's incorporated land area. In areas covered by a neighborhood plan, stakeholders have a greater opportunity to influence land use decisions. That is because changes to the future land use map, which is part of most neighborhood plans, must accompany associated zoning changes. City code requires a public meeting and additional notice for a review of proposed changes by a neighborhood plan contact team, in addition to obtaining approval from the Planning Commission and City Council. This gives stakeholders in areas with a neighborhood plan a greater opportunity to influence their land use in their communities. And it also means there are more steps to take at greater time and expense for stakeholders seeking changes to land use designations. Areas without neighborhood plans have fewer opportunities for influencing land use decisions in their communities. We also observed that the city's neighborhood plans lacked robust and representative participation by stakeholders during their development and adoption. As you can see on this chart, only 13 of the city's 30 neighborhood plans were approved by at least 1% of the neighborhood's population. And in one neighborhood, only 19 residents out of roughly 13,000 approved the neighborhood plan. We were unable to locate the voting records for 6 of the neighborhood plans. We also found that participation by renters was disproportionately low. For example, in one neighborhood, rentals make up 82% of the housing units, but renters made up only 10% of the voters adopting the neighborhood plan. Other neighborhoods had as few as 1 or 2 renters submitting ballots regarding their neighborhood plans. Our second finding regards the neighborhood plan contact teams, and we found that interested stakeholders seeking to engage with their contact team would find most of them inaccessible. Within parts of the city with neighborhood plans, 9% of the planning areas do not have an associated contact team to advocate for their plan. For those areas that do have a contact team, we found that 55% had not submitted contact information for at least one member to the Planning and Zoning Department in the last year. Now, the city's Public Information Office maintains a community registry that allows contact teams to provide the public with information on upcoming meetings. However, our test found that the meeting information for 26 of the 31 contact teams that we looked at was not complete and accurate. When we attempted to obtain meeting information directly from these contact teams, 58% did not provide us information. In one case, our auditors attempted to visit a contact team meeting at the time and place specified in the community registry and found that the library where the meeting was supposed to have occurred was closed. Based on these results, it appears an interested stakeholder might find it difficult to find out when and where their contact team is meeting. If a stakeholder is able to attend a meeting, we found that they would also encounter barriers to participation. We reviewed contact team bylaws and found that all but one created barriers that exceed the requirements for participation that is found in city code. Examples include not allowing a newcomer to participate in decision-making until approved by vote of the existing membership, imposing a 5-year residency requirement, requiring attendance at multiple prior meetings before being allowed to participate. And this may be compounded by the fact that some contact teams meet as infrequently as once a year. Some contact teams require you first to be a member of an area neighborhood association. Now, the neighborhood association may not have a website with information on how to become a member. And although the city prohibits the charging of dues for contact team membership, 5 contact teams require membership in a neighborhood association that charges dues. Our review of contact team bylaws found that they lack some important transparency elements. Specifically, bylaws for 5 contact teams do not include rules on conflicts of interest, and 4 do not require the recording of minutes, including votes or attendance. We also found that how contact teams are defined is not consistent between the city and the teams, and this may result in different expectations among stakeholders. And as currently defined, it is unclear if transparency and integrity regulations, including open meetings laws, apply to contact teams. Our test found that the membership of most contact teams is not representative to the extent intended by city code. Code requires contact teams to pull members to the maximum extent practical from all the member categories indicated here on this slide. It also requires contact teams to submit this membership information to the city. However, we found duplicate, out-of-date, and incomplete entries, and our test revealed that 97% of the contact teams, that's all but one, did not identify at least one person from each of the membership categories. The records also indicated that there are only 7 contact team members citywide who identified as renters. Staff from Planning and Zoning Department is responsible for maintaining membership information reported by the contact teams, and staff at the department does not actively update or verify the information. Our third finding regards neighborhood plans, which the city has not been updating. Our review of the city's 30 neighborhood plans found that 70% of them are greater than 10 years old and the median age is 14. In addition, our city charter, city code, and many of the neighborhood plans themselves stipulate an update cycle ranging from 3 to 7 years. It's true that neighborhood plans, or more specifically their future land use maps, are regularly amended on a piecemeal basis. However, our review found that no neighborhood plans have undergone a comprehensive update since their adoption. Despite the number of years that they have been in place, we found that 59% of the recommendations contained in the neighborhood plans have not been implemented. In fact, only 8 of the 30 plans have seen more than half of their recommendations implemented. These recommendations can include such things as service changes or infrastructure improvements. We also looked at the relationship between neighborhood plans and the Imagine Austin Comprehensive Plan, and we found some inconsistencies. Neighborhood plans are considered to be attachments to and part of Imagine Austin, and city charter requires that elements of the comprehensive plan be coordinated and internally consistent. However, while Imagine Austin emphasizes household affordability, only half of the neighborhood plans include affordability as a goal. In addition, the city's Neighborhood Housing and Community Development Office has issued negative affordability impact statements for 4 of the plans. While existing neighborhood plans were taken into consideration during the development of Imagine Austin, we found no evidence that Imagine Austin has informed the neighborhood plans that were previously adopted. And as mentioned earlier, none of the neighborhood plans have been updated since their adoption. On the other hand, the one neighborhood plan that was developed and adopted since Imagine Austin clearly documents the alignment of its goals with the goals of the comprehensive plan. Our last finding is that fair housing choice was not specifically considered in most neighborhood planning efforts. As a recipient of housing and urban development funds, Austin is required to affirmatively further fair housing through its planning efforts. However, only one neighborhood plan mentions fair housing. In addition, the bylaws template that the Planning and Zoning Department prepares for contact teams does not include language that stresses fair housing choice, and the department has not provided trainings for contact team members on topics related to fair housing. In addition, 2 recent reports identified barriers to housing choice related to neighborhood planning. For instance, the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice report cited complex land use regulations that limit housing choice. And the code diagnosis report completed for the city as part of the Code Next process identified elements of code as being complex, causing delays directly connected to affordability. In order to address these findings, we made several recommendations to the Planning and Zoning Department Director. Our first recommendation is that the department initiate a policy discussion that holistically reevaluates small area planning, including neighborhood planning, as it relates to an up-to-date comprehensive plan and our geographically based council system. We also made several other recommendations addressing the issues described in this presentation. Planning and Zoning concurred with most of our recommendations. However, they did not concur with a recommendation about maintaining an accurate, complete, and up-to-date list of contact team members, and they partially concurred with our recommendation to ensure that the city's neighborhood planning efforts implement a coordinated citywide vision. The department would prefer to balance the value of the recommendation in light of any policy decisions that come out of our first recommendation. That concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Alex, questions? Councilmember Renteria.
Yeah. You know, I was very concerned about this because I know that there were efforts made. I know in my contact team, effort made to update their planning, and they tried. They reached out, and for some reason, city staff wasn't ready for them to do any of these updates. They were supposed to be done every 5 years, I believe. Is that correct? Yeah, and there was no follow-up on that. And I know some of the contact teams, they were ready to go through that process. In fact, some even started it, but they never got a response back about why. I don't know what was the reason for that, but I know that happened, and there was a lot of concern there at the neighborhoods that they weren't able to update their plans. So if someone could tell me why or what happened, I don't know.
Councilmember Greg Guernsey with Director of Planning and Zoning. We do annually have a window when individual property owners can do amendments, and also the contact team can approach us to do amendments, and we periodically bring those to you. Some of those, I think the most recent one was actually in Oak Hill regarding some trails issues and amendments to the plan. But it's correct that we have not gone back and done a comprehensive update of previous neighborhood plans. My staff is concentrating on finishing the ones that have been in the queue because there are neighborhoods that were promised new neighborhood plans. Currently we're working in North Shoal Creek. We'll probably go on to Rosedale. And those are the neighborhoods that are on our list. And due to some staffing issues, that's the path that we're continuing on. That's not to say that existing neighborhood planning contact teams can approach the city with individual amendments, and we would still continue to process those as they're turned in, but not a comprehensive update of a complete neighborhood plan.
Do y'all have any plans on doing a complete comprehensive update on the contact team? Do you have a time take?
I think we would go back and take a look at those. Certainly the ones that we're bringing in now, we're looking at how they would relate to Imagine Austin, but even on the ones that are currently being processed, there's not a clear path to go back to look at those older plans.
And how are y'all going to implement the fair housing choice on those contact team plans? Do you have any plan on doing that?
Yes, and we agreed fully with what the auditor had said. We're going to work with NHCD, Neighborhood Housing Conservation Department, and take a look at training issues to be more inclusive, to work with them on something called the affordability impact statements as we bring plans in. The earlier plans where we had the different planning tools, a lot of those neighborhoods back in the late 90s, actually to the early 2000s, adopted most of those tools. The later neighborhoods have not adopted those, and I think that's where they've come back with some negative AIS reports. But we would go look at changing possibly the bylaws to be more inclusive and provide training for contact teams. And we agree with what the auditor's conclusions were.
Can I just ask a quick point about that last one, though? As I understand this finding, it was that there's not training provided during the neighborhood planning process, and there's not specific consideration. There was not a finding that the neighborhood plans are in violation of fair housing.
No, but
So I want to be just really clear about that.
But there was that the contact teams were not made aware, and we would include that into our process. And certainly the most recent plan that we're working on would probably recognize those fair housing issues.
Okay, thank you. But that, again, that still was not an assessment of whether or not plans are in violation of fair housing.
I don't believe that.
There was not a finding that suggested that. Okay, Councilmember Poole.
Thanks, Mayor Pro Tem. I was curious, which one plan aligns properly? You mentioned in your presentation that there was a plan that...
I think we can figure out who that is. One of the things we were trying to stay away from was getting into naming specific plans. So this plan did this well, this plan did not do this well, and really focus on it kind of comprehensively. But
Well, if you don't want to, the thing is, the reason why I was asking is we should dissect that and figure out why that one that one succeeded, and maybe it could be used as a model going forward. I get the sense that we're not really talking about the neighborhoods falling down on the job, but rather the city didn't provide sufficient training. We didn't have a robust mechanism in place to stay in touch with the people. People move, they get busy. These are volunteers, we're not. So I think that the onus is on the city. If this process is to be successful, and I want it to be successful, the city has to bear significant responsibility for ensuring that any gaps that we identify, and I thank you all for identifying them, but making sure that we're not leaving a neighborhood kind of out there to operate independently and hope to hear from them. We have got to have real oversight on this process. So I will. You don't have to tell me which one neighborhood got the A, but I think that it's important to know that one of them did do well, and that we should look at that and figure out why that one did succeed. So,
Councilmember, we
Yes.
can provide you that offline. The one that you're speaking of had the benefit of being prepared after the adoption of Imagine Austin.
So
So
it
they
was
had
first out of the
the
chute.
benefit of having Imagine Austin in place.
So the level of comprehension and currency as far as the information of Imagine Austin was really close to their preparation of the plan.
That's correct.
I think that's important to know. So the next question I had was, how does staff frame the plan process when beginning it? North Shoal Creek, as you mentioned, Mr. Guernsey, has had 2 meetings now for its neighborhood plan, and that had been delayed for a couple of years, both on their part, they weren't ready, but also making sure we had staff available. So can you talk a little bit about how staff framed the process for the neighbors as they were preparing to undertake the process?
So in North Shoal Creek, and we've had our second meeting. I think we anticipate probably, I think, having 4 or 5 more meetings. We have changed the neighborhood planning process with regards to North Shoal Creek to actually reduce the timeline so we're not losing participants along the way. We anticipate sometime in probably the spring when we would probably wrap this up and start bringing to commission and council. But we go in, and basically the first meeting is more of an introduction, what are areas of change that may be occurring in their neighborhood, kind of frame the process. The last meeting we just had dealt with the issues of mobility, transportation, and I think the next one is talking about land use issues. We'll actually talk about housing, some environmental issues in upcoming meetings. So we're trying to concentrate the topics that are there. We've also made probably a stronger effort to reach out to property owners and renters in this process. Prior to Imagine Austin, for housing issues didn't come up because they weren't discussed as much as in the old Austin Tomorrow Comprehensive Plan as they have been in the Imagine Austin plan that's been adopted by council. So those things have been introduced into our process.
So who is responsible for outreach?
It's actually my department. My staff goes through and makes that. We work through the community registry, which is a tool where neighborhood organizations. We also contact property owners, utility customers as part of that process.
And what do you do to address the renters issue?
Well, that's part of the utility customers. In the past, up until a controversy over North Cross Mall, we really didn't reach out to utility customers as much for site plans, zoning cases, subdivisions, or our neighborhood planning process. And so that engages those that are utility customers, which gets to the rental portion. It's always been difficult, I think, to get renters to come out. We try to make an effort to make sure that they are included in the process for the very reasons that the auditor had found. Property owners, they feel they have more of a stake, I think, in their property, and they're more familiar with it because usually they're living there for a longer period of time. But we recognize that there are more renters in Austin than there are property owners, and so their voice is very much of a concern of ours.
And if the rent, okay, can you just expand a little bit on that, about why you say that renters are a concern?
Well, it's hard to engage someone who has less of a stake possibly within the neighborhood if they're transitioning from moving from one apartment to another, or moving from rental property in one part of the city to another. So we make that effort through the list that we gain at our first meeting and second meeting. We have a list of people that we have and try to make sure we maintain with them. The neighborhood organizations that are listed usually are more inclusive, and certainly when we get to the contact team, we actually need representation to have a balanced contact team as part of that process. But that initial outreach is really through the utility customers that we have.
Do we ever separate out long-term renters who maybe have lived, like maybe older folks who have lived in an apartment as an economic choice? Maybe they had owned a home and then they sold it and then they're living on the proceeds of that nest egg in an apartment. Or people who are new to town who have taken an apartment until they can find a part of town they want to live in. You know, there's different reasons for renting. Do we ever go out and poll people to find out their reasons for renting?
Not to my knowledge.
That might be helpful if we are trying to identify renters who wish to participate in the planning process. And I think you're right that you want to have a stake in where you live, and different people have different reasons for renting or owning. And if we can identify the people who are long-term renters who really do feel like a part of the neighborhood, which I think is what you're talking about, to get their involvement, we may want to reach out and find reasons for why people rent versus own. And I know in the last 5 to 6, 7 years since the Great Recession, getting a mortgage loan has been probably the biggest impediment for most people who may want to own. Coming up with a higher down payment is a harder task than it was, I know, when I bought my first house. And we can't, that's the banks, and we don't have a lot of control over that, but that may be something where we might have some creative ways to help people. But I think my point being, if we can identify which group of renters are more likely or more interested in what goes on in their neighborhood, we may have a better ability to encourage them to participate. We can't mandate people's participation, but we can encourage it and make it seem like a positive experience. And then I wanted to ask, the contact teams are inaccessible point in finding 2. Is that, again, a responsibility? Where does the responsibility for that lie? Is that a shared responsibility? Do we lose track of people from lack of contact?
So our contact teams are basically self-created.
And volunteer, is
they're
that
volunteer.
correct?
The city, although I have the ability to perhaps introduce the contact team when they're initially appointed, there's not a mechanism where I can go in and say, to have the authority to force them to have an election or force them to maintain a certain level of status. I think this was partly recognized last year by the City Council when there was a resolution to go back and amend their planning contact team rules, because we had some contact teams that, as the auditor pointed out correctly, have some membership requirements that may say you have to reside in a particular neighborhood for 5 years before you can really be a participant in the neighborhood planning process. Although there is a provision now in our code that was approved by this council last January, that has a provision where someone can bring, I guess, a complaint or a protest to me. There's not a corresponding rule that would make me go back out and to ensure that contact teams are as responsible as perhaps they should be.
So you have bylaws for the contact teams, or
We
for the...
do.
Okay.
And we have
do they allow for charging dues?
That is something that we're going to, and I agree with the auditor on this point as well, we'd have to go back and to look at. I was not aware of that fact until the auditor brought that to my attention, that someone would have to belong to a particular neighborhood organization before they could be a member of a contact team. That's certainly not the intent of a contact team. That would require you to belong to a separate organization before you could join a contact team.
I mean, I can see some value in having people who have lived in an area for their institutional knowledge about the area, although I don't know how many years that means. So that would be an interesting question to unpack, and I'm concerned about the charging of dues.
Yeah, contact teams do not charge dues.
Okay.
I think it was alluded to that there are some contact teams that may require a membership in some neighborhood organization, and that's something that we agree with the auditor we're going to go back and look at, but that was certainly not the intent of a contact team, that you have to be part of a dues-paying organization. It should be representative of business owners and renters, property owners. Also, neighborhood organizations can be part of that, but not that you are forced to join a particular group that has to pay dues.
And my understanding is most neighborhood associations, if they charge dues, they're fairly low, like $5 or $15.
The city of Austin does not monitor, regulate neighborhood organizations. They are representative of homeowners associations, just groups of citizens that may live within a block or several hundred blocks. They can be created and disband at will. And so that's what makes it a challenge when we're working in Austin with neighborhood organization. We may have, the city demographer one time plotted a map for me about 15 years ago, and I think there was one particular area in East Austin that was covered by 16 neighborhood organizations. There may have only been one contact team, but there were 16 different neighborhood organizations that all claim that same area as part of their boundary. So it's challenging enough to work with contact teams as opposed to working with different neighborhood organizations.
And yet the networks are important to our work, so it makes sense to...
They are, and it is a way for the city, through all our communications on various applications, including neighborhood plans, to reach out to different groups.
And I guess my last question for today is, why do you think the contact team effort is so problematic?
I think you have individuals in neighborhood planning areas that feel real allegiance to their neighborhoods, which is a good thing. But a lot of our neighborhoods, especially in the areas where we have neighborhood plans, which are the areas probably we've had the most change in the last 10, 15 years, they're seeing things change around them, and they don't necessarily agree with all the changes that may be happening. And so you end up seeing some rules where you have to participate in 3 meetings before you can really be a member of a neighborhood planning contact team, or you have to reside in the area for a certain number of years. And I think those are some of the reasons why you see some neighborhood planning contact teams, particularly those that are probably more represented by property owners, coming forward, because they see it as a way of kind of defending, I think, their status quo, and maybe rebelling against some of that change. But we really do need to embrace those new folks that are coming into the areas, and those businesses as well. Both renters and businesses are probably underrepresented, and there are neighborhood organizations that will certainly reach out to businesses, but may not in a lot of others. And so that is, I think, some of the challenge. Unless there's a particular change that a property owner has initiated in land within a neighborhood planning area that may affect a business or may affect a renter, usually it's the property owners that will come out and give that voice.
Well, I think there's 2 things I would say in response to that. One, as an example, political clubs that make endorsements. in order to ensure against stacking, which is when a whole lot of people join at the last minute in order to vote for a particular candidate and maybe skew the results. They have implemented some meeting attendance requirements in advance of a time frame for an election, so that you don't have spiking membership in order to affect an outcome. And so I can see why some of the contact teams, because this is an official capacity and it's really important to the neighborhoods, that they would want to make sure that the people who are having the official voice with the city understand what the situation or what the circumstances are of the neighborhood, and that there's buy-in from the people who live. I mean, because isn't that also an important part of the contact team? They're supposed to be reflecting back what the neighbors are looking for. Is that correct?
That's correct, and
Okay.
it's very important. We work with contact teams annually to make sure that, and we spoke to implementation, but they're the ones that we interact with to ensure that those things that are within a neighborhood plan can be achieved for all the list of recommendations that they have.
You want a deliberative process in your contact team process. And so the second thing I would say to that is that the feedback from the city and the education and the framing of the conversation is really, really important, so that if you have a lack of trust built up in a neighborhood that is showing up in a contact team response to something that the city is trying to do, that conversation hasn't happened probably at the level that it needs to with the group that it needs to, so that by the time the contact team is hearing from their neighbors, that they have a more balanced understanding of what the people who are most affected by any changes in that neighborhood would feel. So rather than choosing up sides or rebelling, to use your word, we would frame it in ways where the conversation begins early enough on and enough people are understanding what's going on so that they can keep up with the change. And I think that's really our challenge, especially us on the dais. Our job is to make sure that, one of them is to make sure that when things change with the city, the residents have sufficient time to hear about it and to understand it and to raise questions or concerns that they might have, and then we can answer them, so that we are in a place where we really are making change that is coherent and there's buy-in from the residents, because that's our best scenario, right? That the change that comes is understood by the people to whom it is affecting, who are affected by it, and also that they may give us the benefit of their good insights about, well, this piece is really good, but this one over here, if you just tweak it a wee bit, it'll be better. And then we don't have the conflict, or not as much conflict.
Sure.
Yeah, and I have some questions too, but Councilmember Renteria, go ahead.
Yeah, I know that when we passed we amend the contact team ordinance, that we also asked that y'all would hold elections on January, because that's what the biggest problem that we were facing, is that people weren't having elections. They weren't allowing people to participate. There was some contact groups that only, like you said, were only meeting once, twice, or three times a year, only in so-called important zoning changes so they were not. They were having a lot of problems. So that's why when we amended the ordinance, it was that it gave the city more power overseeing the contact team. At one time, y'all didn't have the power to tell the contact team that they had to have elections, that they had to. Now y'all do have that. So I hope that, when y'all come January, that some of these groups that have not have elections, that have been, they have their rules where people cannot attend these meetings or have a vote, and they were having these contact meetings at places that wasn't public. They were at small businesses, and so we want to make sure that they're done the right way, where it is a very public place, and the people that show up are allowed to vote. I know that some contact teams have different. They divide their neighborhood into neighborhood sectors, and they have representatives from each neighborhood. but we need to really look at how they're operating because, we have contact teams that in my district, and we've been going out and telling people, hey, these neighbors, these neighborhood associations like Go Valley and Johnson Terrace have never been able to participate in their contact team because they were told they were not allowed to. And we're not going to be able to run and manage a city where we have just very few individuals that think that they run. They're the ones that runs the whole neighborhood. They got to be inclusive, and that's why we amended that contact team.
And council members, certainly we can make sure that their bylaws follow the template. I don't really have, I guess, a hammer to make sure that they approve bylaws that are strictly enforced. I think that's the challenge that I have. When we go out into have neighborhood planning contact teams perhaps come in for a quarterly basis, we can certainly encourage them to be more inclusive, to probably have more meetings. But I think the challenge for me and my staff is that I can't dictate the location of their meetings. I can't necessarily dictate the exact time when they have their meetings. And if they don't follow their bylaws to the letter, unless someone complains, which I am grateful for now, because although there has not been a formal complaint filed, at least citizens have a way to say, my contact team is not being inclusive. I have been excluded. I want to file a protest. At least I have that mechanism. But there's not a mechanism to really go police them to make sure that they're following all their bylaws.
And I'm glad to hear that because we also have groups out there that have been complaining that they're not, that they've been trying to form a contact team and there's other groups that didn't want them to form. And I hope that y'all can go and recognize the groups that really want to form a contact team and let them just go ahead and form these contact teams, because that's why I amended the ordinance there so that we can have these groups. You have people that they're meeting that comes in and neighborhood groups that meet, and there's over 60 people, and the contact team has only 3 people out there making all the decisions. That's not fair, especially when you have a group like Holly that say, hey, we want to have a contact team, and we need to just say, okay, you're going to become the contact team.
Yeah, Holly, in particular, I spent probably a year and a half with a mediator the city hired on my own within our department, and the result was when we got to the final meeting, the neighborhood rejected.
I was there, but yeah, and
it was.
I think it's changing quickly too, and we need to now take advantage of these groups that really want to form a contact team now. Because back then, yes, they thought maybe by not forming contact team, they were going to keep development out, but it didn't happen. It doesn't happen that way. We need to really recognize the people that really want to work with us on their neighborhood and plan it out, and not resist that the few that are the loudest out there screaming at the top of their lungs that they don't want a contact team, while the rest of them, our neighborhood really wants one. So.
Well, we stand ready to try to create contact teams that are fair, equitable. However, I feel like in that particular case, my parting words to the neighbors that if you want us to come back, please invite us, but I'm not going to force a contact team on a neighborhood that does not want one.
I have some questions that get back to the decision not to talk about which teams are doing what. I've thought a lot about that since I got the briefing last week from the auditor. For example, you noted one planning team, I believe it was one planning team, that requires membership in a neighborhood association. And it's not clear to me whether that neighborhood association charges dues or not. But it sounds to me like that's either a violation of one or two of the principles that we have set up for neighborhood planning teams. And I'd actually like to know which one it is. In part because then as we started talking, I think I heard it used in the plural, that there are neighborhood planning teams that are requiring neighborhood association membership. And so, and I'll get to my concern about that later. But, and I'm not asking you to tell me what it is now. I'm just registering a concern that you've made some strong findings about membership challenges, and we want to work to get rid of those barriers, because I think the council and we have some very set rules on what neighborhood planning teams are able to do and what they're not able to do in terms of having membership. And if some of them are requiring, or if one of them, again, it's not clear to me whether there's one or several that are requiring dues, then they need to stop doing it, and they need to be cautioned that that's not okay. On the other hand, I think it is a challenge for some of these neighborhood planning teams to come to council and present their case with an audit like this in the background that suggests that there are flaws all over the place, when that, frankly, I think there are some isolated incidents. I think there are some isolated instances of practices that some of which can be easily corrected, some of which I think need to be monitored. And so I just expressed that as a concern, and I wondered if you could address how that factored a little bit more about your thinking about not making it clear which neighborhood planning teams are having what. Again, it's not even clear to me how those cross and overlap. Is the planning team that's requiring neighborhood membership, does that neighborhood association require dues? It's hard for me to align these issues when we're not naming names.
Right, and I think, so a couple of things. One, I believe there are at least 5 contact teams that require membership in the neighborhood organization. Whether or not those organizations charge dues, we could not always determine. I believe we could not always determine. The team may have more on that. But from my perspective, one of the things, we were looking at really the city, our audit, or not our, we were auditing the city and the way that the city interacts with the contact teams. So rather than having it come across more of an audit of individual contact teams, that was the reason why I didn't want to get into naming them specifically. We definitely don't name them in the report, and we name them all in the report, actually, in an appendix, but we don't name which teams had which issues. I think what we saw started coming to our attention pretty early on was that this was a cross-cutting issue. Wasn't, there's some teams that are doing everything exactly as we would want them to, but it seemed to be here and there. So some had bylaws that were more restrictive than others. Some had participation requirements, required membership in a neighborhood organization. So we saw issues, I think, in a lot of different teams across the city. And so rather than kind of name, well, this team did this or this team did this, we really wanted to look at it from what's the city's role in this and what can we do, really what can planning and zoning do as the liaison to these groups to try to improve the transparency, the consistency, et cetera.
Well, thank you for that explanation. I think that helps. So I guess then my question would be back to Mr. Guernsey. I hear you say that you can't monitor or police those, but certainly I hope that you're aware of which neighborhood planning teams had some of these issues, so that there can be communication from neighborhood planning and zoning that, hey, you're requiring something that's not permitted within our code. So do you know which of the associations are having particular kinds of problems, and what is your plan for at least communicating out? I understand you can't monitor and you can't necessarily be aware of violations, but you can certainly communicate out what the expectations are with all of our planning teams.
And I would probably go back and probably talk with the auditor about the same issue, but it's not just talking to one, because there may be others that are thinking about this. So I would go back and probably talk to all of those contact
Well, that's why I said,
teams.
what is your plan for communicating with all of the neighborhood planning teams about the expectations?
And we would be doing that probably in one of the upcoming quarterly meetings. We meet and invite contact teams to come in on a quarterly basis. One of the issues that we probably end up talking as well would be fair housing and conflicts of interest, which I think was also brought up by the auditor. So that would probably be our means of going out and speaking with them and taking a look at, with the Planning Commission, maybe updating the bylaws themselves, the template, and reporting back. See if we can make those changes to make sure that they're more inclusive.
And certainly I hope and I would expect that part of that would be communicating about where they should be meeting and how they should be publicizing the meetings, because that's also a very serious, I agree, that's a very serious barrier to participation if people don't know where the meeting is and at what time.
And that's something that the auditor also pointed out, that we agree, working with the community registry or seeing if there's a way we can work to publicize the meetings that they have through a tool that's in the community registry, or expanding that.
Great. And I know that, as you indicated last year, I think it was last year, there were some changes to the bylaws for neighborhood planning teams. And so my hope is that some of what we're seeing in this audit is a lack of understanding about what some of the clarifications were.
Yeah, and I think earlier, as I said, in the year, we went back and worked with the different neighborhood planning contact teams. I think we had, based on the information I had, we had, I think, 110 stakeholders, 291 responded to neighborhood planning contact teams that were working well, what kind of training, what things that need to be overhauled, that came back in response of creating the ordinance amendment that council approved. So there was buy-in for that process, and buy-in to having some more standardized templates. And so we have implemented those, but I think we can go back and look at those things about fair housing, conflict of interest, making sure that they're more inclusive, and those are things we'll probably look at the template again.
But some of them, I thought that the bylaw changes also spoke to things like publicizing the meeting, membership, who can belong, what you can do and can't do, such as charging an admission, I mean, not an admission, a membership dues. So those I thought we had addressed in that bylaw template.
There again, what's in the bylaws, I don't have necessarily a way to make sure that they're enforced. And so if there's something in there that maybe is not as clear, then we can work on trying to make that more clear in a standard bylaw template. If there are things that they are doing that I'm not aware of, then those are things I'm not sure how I would get to. But we would reemphasize those three things I talked about, the inclusion, conflict of interest, fair housing, to make sure that those things are followed, that profess those when we do our training. But I don't necessarily have a mechanism to know if somebody is in violation of those things when they happen.
But I thought I understood the audit to have been conducted by looking at bylaws, that's how they assess some of the divergences in membership. And so if the auditor can find that by looking at the bylaws, I'm not sure that I understand why planning and zoning staff can't, as they look over the bylaws, see, hey, this veers from our policy.
Right.
Regardless, I understand things can happen out there in practice that you're not aware of. But if they veer from our expectation and our standard on the face of it, then that should signal an issue.
Right, and I agree, and we would probably point that out, but I don't necessarily have a mechanism to force that contact team to do something. If I have a complaint, then there's a way for me to follow and take that perhaps to mediation, then go to the planning commission, and perhaps even appeal to the city council. But I don't have a way to systematically disincorporate a contact team if they don't follow our template exactly, or exclude someone from their process. I don't have a stick other than maybe just letting commission know and letting council know, and more particularly having a conversation with that contact team saying, look, these things are important. You're not following the bylaw template, but I can't make.
I understand your point about enforcement, but I guess my question is your staff looking over that and seeing those issues and then communicating with the planning team?
And that's why I'm saying I'm in agreement. If those things are in there, then we will go do that.
Okay.
But,
so I just want to, you're not having a situation where you're finding the same issues the auditor did. You're communicating with that planning team and they're refusing to make those changes. It doesn't sound to me like we've gotten
I don't think I've
to that stage.
I can't think of a particular case where I've had a contact team rebel that put up a formal protest, but certainly what was mentioned by the auditor about, saying someone has to reside in the neighborhood for 5 years, that is a difficult one, and we would certainly have a conversation. But I think I would go back and then try to work with that contact team to try to bring them in more into compliance, more into alignment with what we desire of contact teams.
I think that's really appropriate. And then if they have something in there that is in clear violation of the city's expectations for planning teams, and they, after being communicated with, do not change it, I think it's perfectly appropriate to communicate with council and with the land use commissions that that's the case. My guess is if planning teams are made aware of the ways in which, if they do veer from the expectations, I think if they're made aware of them, most are going to make that correction. That would be my guess. Okay, so then I have some other more specific questions. On page 9 of the audit, there is a finding that neighborhood plans have not been fully aligned with the city's comprehensive plan. And then there is a recommendation, I think, later, or is it in the response? In the recommendations on page 13, that is sort of reasserted. Identify where existing neighborhood plans do not reflect the goals of Imagine Austin and work with community stakeholders to improve alignment. And I'm real interested in hearing some examples that you found in your audit where neighborhood plans did not align with Imagine Austin.
Okay.
I don't believe I saw any cited in here.
Okay. And I think I mentioned that in our presentation. One is regarding, let me find it here. Okay. Household affordability. That only half of the neighborhood plans include affordability as a goal, and that is one of the goals of Imagine Austin. And so that's one example of areas where we saw that they are not in alignment or not.
So they don't
completely in
mention the word
alignment.
affordability, or they don't include any provisions?
They don't include affordability as a goal.
Okay.
Can you elaborate on that?
Okay. Do they include all of? Were you also looking for all of the other goals of Imagine Austin, like historic preservation, et cetera, and sort of checking them off to make sure every neighborhood plan had alignment?
Michael
in that
McGill,
way?
our project manager for the audit.
Good morning, Mayor Pro Tem, council members. One of the things that we were looking at was the code diagnosis from 2015 that did a review of all the goals from neighborhood plans, and they put them into broad categories. And in those cases, they were summed up by how many times they occurred and by how many times they occurred in each plan as well. And in that case, we found only 15 of them had affordability as a goal within them. So that was one example. What we did not find was any similar example of how many Imagine Austin goals existed in the neighborhood plans themselves.
So, for example, I mean, affordability in that term, were you also looking at plans such as the Bowling Creek plan that identified affordable housing as a goal? Would that have qualified as affordability if they didn't use the word affordability?
Sure. What I would say is that we saw no review of this occurring. So the alignment efforts, we did observe that there was a process with the Planning Commission with community members during the development of Imagine Austin to review the neighborhood plans as they existed at that time and to look at how that could be incorporated into Imagine Austin as it was developing. What we did not find was that those plans were also reviewed after Imagine Austin was completed. And so, as one example, the neighborhood plan that occurred after Imagine Austin was adopted specifically talks to how neighborhood plans are there to implement a complete community which was a part of the vision of Imagine Austin, which includes multiple goals. And so that would be the expectation that those neighborhood plans involve multiple goals from Imagine Austin.
I think I hear a couple different things, though. I think you're suggesting that existing neighborhood plans, and especially those that were done before Imagine Austin, should go back, review their plan, and use some of this language. I mean, complete communities was not a phrase people were using 15 years ago. If you have a neighborhood plan from 15 years ago, it's not going to include that phrase. I don't think that's the same. I'm not sure that really supports a finding that neighborhood plan does not reflect the goals of Imagine Austin, and that is the finding. It is not that they're not being updated and made current. Well, you are saying they're not updated, but the finding that neighborhood plans do not, that there are some that do not reflect the goals is a pretty strong finding, and I'd like to better understand what some of the examples are that were giving rise to that finding.
Mayor Bertram, I think Michael has actually said it correctly. When we did Imagine Austin, we looked at the neighborhood plans, contact teams, the Planning Commission independently looked at their plans, and they were not in conflict with Imagine Austin. But it is also correct, and if you look on page 10, there's these little arrows that show going one way, we took neighborhood plans or small area plans and looked at them in light of the comprehensive plan Imagine Austin. But that is correct. We have not gone back and then applied the 8 priorities to each of the neighborhood plans and introduce and revise each of those neighborhood plans prior to Imagine Austin to reflect Imagine Austin goals and priorities. They're not necessarily in conflict, but then we're not actually going back and mending those. And I think the challenge is in going forward to do that would take quite a bit of time to go back and update all those plans. And I think and we had a very frank discussion, I think, over maybe 2 or 3 meetings with the auditor's office about how to balance the recommendation of taking Imagine Austin and going back and mending those small area plans, at the same time trying to move forward with new plans. And I think it's one of the few times I think that the auditor and I didn't agree, because we were looking at recommendation number 1 about trying to provide equity and balance for all the different neighborhoods in Austin, and looking how we might do small area plans in the future that might be beyond neighborhood planning boundaries, and at the same time concentrating my staff and efforts of looking at the
Right.
old ones and trying to bring them up.
Yeah, I think I'm understanding what you're talking about the updating. I guess I'm still, if the auditor has any additional examples, I still would like to understand where the existing neighborhood plans do not reflect the goals of Imagine Austin. I think I would like to hear some more examples of that.
So again, we're using our word choice here is alignment and not conflict. And so what we were looking at was the alignment efforts. Long-term planning was also the subject of an audit approximately 10 years ago. And at that time, neighborhood plans were found to not have a consistent vision for the city. And so those plans that were found to not be consistent with a larger vision for the city have not been updated since that time either, in the 10 years since.
And although at the time staff did not agree with a lot of what the auditor did have to say, I think on maybe 3 out of 4 points of that audit, we did move forward with Imagine Austin because the prior comprehensive plan was gone back to 1980. And so we did move forward with a new comprehensive plan that did get adopted that would help align new ones. But a lot of the older plans were done, although the Austin Tomorrow Comprehensive Plan recognized the importance of neighborhood plans, it perhaps did not align them as well to the old comprehensive plan, for which the majority of these small area plans prior to Imagine Austin were following more of an independent course.
Okay. I think I'll just register that I'm not certain that I understand. I understand what you're saying about updating, and that appears to be the case. I'm not sure that I'm convinced that there were specific findings that there are existing neighborhood plans that don't reflect the goals. but we'll just leave it for now, I think.
And I think, I know Michael said this, but just kind of to reiterate, we're not talking about these plans conflict with Imagine Austin. We're talking about there was no effort to align past plans with our more recently adopted comprehensive plan. Certainly we can talk internally and provide more examples of that.
Sure.
But,
I think if it said if, identify if existing plans do not, or, it's a pretty clear assertion there that there are examples where they don't. And so that concerns me, given the lack of examples in the report itself. The other area where I would name that, and I'm not saying it's not true that there aren't examples, they're just not in the report, and that's on the same page. Let me just see if I can find it again. Developing an approach to address existing plans and associated zoning where barriers to fair housing have been identified. And again, there certainly may be barriers in our neighborhood plans, but in this audit, unless I'm missing it, I'm not clear what those barriers are and how many plans exhibited barriers, but it's there's a pretty clear assertion where barriers have been identified, there should be an approach to make changes. And again, to me, that's an if. If you don't have a list of the examples of neighborhood plans that have specific barriers to fair housing, and again, maybe I'm missing the specific examples as they fall within the report. So I would ask the auditor to respond, especially if there are some examples that I'm not catching.
Sure. So on page 11, there is a quote there from the Analysis of Impediments to Fair Housing Choice from May 2015 that cites a couple of different factors or impediments as they identified. Those were also included in the City of Austin's action plan, which it submitted to HUD in both 2015 and 2016 as identified impediments.
And that seems to be I see the quote, overly complex land use regulations.
That is correct.
That's the main example, that there are impediments within neighborhood plans for fair housing, with regard to fair housing, that there are overly complex land use regulations.
It was also identified in the code diagnosis as well.
And Mayor Pro Tem and in committee, that is being addressed, the fair housing in Code Next. So that was something we did agree, and we're making sure that Code Next does address fair housing issues.
Okay. Councilmember Pohl.
Wouldn't that be a policy decision? Well, let me ask, the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, who wrote that? Is that a city document?
It was commissioned by the City of Austin. I believe it was BBC and Associates, who also prepared the comprehensive housing market study. And it was also included in, as I said, City of Austin's action plan, which NHCD prepares and sends to HUD.
And okay. Let me go back to what the Mayor Pro Tem was talking about. The word choice of affordability, was that a document search for the word? And what other elements of the code were looked for? And was affordability defined?
So for that, the evidence that we relied on was the code diagnosis. There's an appendix. It's also linked in the bibliography of this audit, which talks about the categorization of each of the goals within the neighborhood plans, and it counts them off.
How many times did historic preservation show up in the plans?
I'd be happy to look it up and send it to you.
Well, I think the point is
it
that
was one of the categories, yes.
And as is connectivity, and connectivity is not just with cars, but pedestrian and bicycles. And so there are, 8 elements, I think, to Imagine Austin?
There are 8 priority programs. I'll let
Yes, 8 priority programs. So I can't say what the auditor found as far as each one in their word search of all the different neighborhood plans that we have.
So this goes back to my question about setting the framework, and were the contact teams aware of the elements that they needed to have in their bylaws and in their operations, and what review was done by staff and on what schedule. And I think you all have answered that you didn't have sufficient staffing or time to have a comprehensive oversight of the contact teams.
Yeah, well, yes, those things are true, but again, we looked at the neighborhood plans in context of Imagine Austin, and maybe not vice versa. We didn't take Imagine Austin and apply them to each of the small area plans, neighborhood plans prior to Imagine Austin, and look to revise them because of the issues of staffing and time, addressing those at the same time moving forward with the plans that we've already promised that we would go forward with.
Well, I just joined my colleague, Mayor Pro Tem, in having a number of concerns about the findings in the audit, and we'll probably have some additional conversations specifically about which contact teams are working and why, and what robust education and oversight and enforcement elements the staff has or we need to give them, what resources you may need. I think that for this system to work properly, the city has to be an active participant and guiding what is going on and maintaining active oversight as well, so that we don't fall down some holes and have things going awry. But I thank you for your efforts in pulling all of this together. It certainly raises a lot of questions.
And I have some additional specific questions. So another recommendation on page 12 is to consider appropriate roles for the Planning Commission and the Zoning and Platting Commission, and later on it suggests, or somewhere else in the audit report, it suggests merging the two. Now, this was certainly a recommendation that received a lot of discussion during the discussion about the boards and commissions and was rejected because of the workload. So I'm curious as to how the audit, it's not clear to me even why the audit concerned itself with that piece of it. I'm not sure I understand how that arose as a finding or a recommendation supported by the audit. So if you could help me understand that context, please.
Sure. And in footnote 1, we do note that it was a recommendation from the Transition Task Force, and that it was heard by the City Council at that time, and that it was not adopted. There was one section of their recommendations with regards to a joint small area planning subcommittee of the two commissions, Zoning and Platting and Planning Commission, that was adopted. What we were looking at here was the difference in land use treatment on whether you are in a neighborhood plan area or if you are not. And one of the things that we noted, and that was noted to us, is that you go to different land use commissions based on where you are in the city.
Yet that, in and of itself, I mean, they both studiously look at the issues and understand them. I mean, they're basically just dealing with different geographic areas of the city. So can you help me understand again how that supports one of your findings, and which of those findings does it relate most closely to? I mean, to me, it's a bit of a policy recommendation rather than a natural recommendation stemming from one of the audit findings.
So I think it supports our overall finding, which was that there's different planning processes for areas with neighborhood plans and those without. And then we're just citing that.
And in terms of the bullets, you'll note within that recommendation, what we're saying is that there should be a policy discussion about this topic, and that's one of the topics that should be included in the discussion. We're not recommending. We're basically recommending that policy discussion include consideration of the roles of those two commissions, and I think that's come up in more than one, but certainly most recently in the Board and Commission Task Force. So while we're not specifying what that role should be, we're saying that should be part of the discussion.
Okay, I thought elsewhere in the report, I thought it actually suggested that the two be combined, because the staff response was to not concur. Was to concur, but saying staff is in favor of having. Oh, okay. So maybe it was the staff who were saying. I apologize. It was the department staff who were suggesting one land use commission.
Yes, Mayor Pro Tem, and previously the Zoning and Platting Commission and the Planning Commission together make a land use commission. And the Zoning and Planning Commission was anticipated to have a limited life to get through the city's comprehensive plan and probably beyond Code Next, and then that commission, the Zoning and Planning Commission, would be sunset, and then we would just have the Planning Commission. In the long run, I think that is probably the best thing, is to have a single commission that would look at all of the issues involving our city as far as land use recommendations and recommendations for council for recommending policy changes. I think the challenge right now by the board and commission transition task force was they recommended that the Zoning and Planning Commission handle all the zoning cases, subdivision cases, and Planning Commission handle all the plan amendments, comprehensive plan, CIP. The difficult part for that is, and staff would disagree with that recommendation, is that a neighborhood organization, a contact team, a property owner would end up having to go to two commissions, one that would go to the Planning Commission to hear recommendations as they relate to a small area plan or the comprehensive plan, and then appear at a different commission, the Zoning and Planning Commission, to have a zoning case, site plan, or subdivision to be considered, and actually would create a second step if you were in one of those areas. Right now, we think it works better to have those decisions actually separated, because you're only dealing with one commission and not two. And that the one commission, the Planning Commission, although we might capture in the minutes very briefly, unless the Zoning and Planning Commissioner heard what happened at the Planning Commission, they would be disjointed. So we agree that there are two different boards. They serve two different parts of the city, as the auditor pointed out, and may not necessarily be as balanced, because they're looking at different issues, or different boards, or different individuals serving on those. We would certainly recognize that. Staff would say that the board and commission transition task force recommendation, we would not endorse that, because then it basically has a decision going to two different places and almost results in the same thing, but it may be at different levels. And we would advocate someday that we'd have one commission that would look at all those issues, that would take care of the equity, I think, issue that's expressed by the auditor. But then at the same time, you would have one body that would consider the plan and the actual action, maybe on a zoning case or site plan.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And again, apologies that I attributed the merger to the audit rather than the department response. One probable last question. There is a recommendation of providing equal standing to all applicants when petitioning the Planning Commission for plan amendments or updates. I want to be sure I understand that recommendation.
So again, this is part of recommendation one, which was a suggestion for to be a part of the policy discussion, which I believe the staff concurred with. This really stems from the fact that in Article 16 of the city code, there are additional privileges to contact teams to create, amend or update a neighborhood plan. The charter in Article 10 states that the Planning Commission is responsible for the comprehensive plan and all elements or attachments thereto. And so what this is suggesting is to review the possibility of the Planning Commission fulfilling that charter specified role and allowing for a petition from all or any interested party, inclusive of contact teams, for amendments or updates.
I missed the last
For amendments
three
or
phrases.
updates.
Okay, so in other words, that would that is a recommendation that the discussion include
So some of the
whether
things,
or not to remove the current piece of the process that confines the plan amendments to planning team
I would
during
say,
a particular period. I mean, they have a particular period where they can make recommendations. Other people can apply for any other applicant. A property owner can apply for an amendment outside of that period. They just have to pay for it. Isn't that accurate, Mr. Guernsey?
If there's a particular property owner that would like a change to the future land use map, they have an annual time period. I think our point was is that someone could go petition the Planning Commission asking them to do a change. But we do recognize that contact teams exist and they have certain rights within their area, but I don't think it stops anyone from going to the Planning Commission, regardless of who they are, and saying, we would like to see this change. I think it's just a policy decision that councils have made many, many years ago to establish contact teams and empower them in a certain way, but it doesn't necessarily preclude someone from going to the commission and asking, appealing, I guess, to the council or to the Planning Commission, asking them to do something else, even though they might not live within that boundary.
So I guess then I'd like to just hear from the auditor again why that's a recommendation based on your findings.
So a number of the findings did pertain to the contact teams, whether the accessibility of them, the representation of them. And so the Planning Commission, as imagined by the charter, is a citizen body appointed by the council to be as representative as the council wishes to oversee that. And so this address, it also has staff support. It also has the obligation to follow City Code of Ethics, as well as Texas Open Meetings Act and Public Information Act. So many of the concerns that we heard regarding the accessibility of contact teams are already addressed within the body that is set out by charter.
So the recommendation, so based, I guess, on the findings of need for better notification and standard membership practices, that drove the conclusion that the neighborhood planning team maybe shouldn't be the body hearing requests during that time period to forward, even though they had another avenue?
I think the recommendation was just to open the door, and it would also address those plans that do not have a contact team as well.
Okay.
And regarding the Open Meetings Act, it has been staff's practice and consultation with our law department that neighborhood contact teams aren't necessarily subject to the Open Meetings Act of the state of Texas. I think that's been our position for quite a while. And to have really an alignment of a neighborhood organization outside of a neighborhood planning area and a neighborhood planning contact team to have the same standing it would be difficult to do, but not impossible to do. But you may end up getting to a point where either you start eliminating the powers of neighborhood planning contact teams and then empower neighborhood organizations that maybe do not have overlapping boundaries because of concern of maybe you'd have multiple neighborhood organizations all saying that they have the same power as a contact team. It is a difficult situation, but we still think someone could come before the commission and certainly make a position to have an amendment to a neighborhood plan. But short of doing away with all the small area plans, neighborhood plans, and putting contact teams in the same level as a neighborhood organization and having equity among all the neighborhood organizations, I'm not sure if you could really get to a place where there is true equity throughout the city of neighborhood representation.
Okay. I had some additional questions just very quickly. Thank you for laying out the kinds of groups that were part of the discussion on page 3, interviewed planning and zoning staff. I think there's also a reference to community groups engaged in neighborhood planning. I wonder if you have a list of those who were interviewed as part of that within the appendix, any of the appendices?
We do not.
We do not. We
Is
can
it
certainly
possible
provide that
to provide?
information
Yeah,
to
I
you.
would love to get some more information about who participated in those interviews. Okay, other questions? Okay, is there a motion to accept this audit? Councilmember Poole moves acceptance of the audit. Councilmember Renteria seconds it. Any discussion? I'll say I really appreciate. I think some of the findings are very important, and I hope the staff will move forward in really making sure there's consistency to when people are meeting and how they're publicizing it, and a real effort to educate our planning teams, especially those, all of them, but especially those who may be veering away from our expectations and standards. I will say I'm starting to understand my concern about a few of these findings, and I think part of it is I have some discomfort with assertions that sound like there are barriers or conflicts in some of the neighborhood plans based on an assessment that was done by our code team. Not rather than finding and citing particular examples in the plan that gave rise to that, there is an assertion. The assertion seems to be based on, pardon me, talking too much with my hands, some assumptions and points made by our code team and the code diagnosis, and that triangulation is of concern to me, especially when one of the general comments is overly complex land use regulations. To me, that's very general, and not anyway. So I'm going to vote to accept it, but with that expression of concern. I think there's a lot of value in here, but I do have those points of concern with those findings and how they were released. But thank you very much, all of you, for your work and your comments.
Mayor Pro Tem, I'd like to underscore and repeat the concerns that you have. Some of the language that's in the audit is judgmental, and I'm not sure that is necessarily appropriate. I think it should have been more objective, and there may have been some emphasis put on some sources that maybe had not been vetted through this council as far as policy. We, for example, haven't adopted some of the pieces that were under the fair housing in here, and but this is presented as if it is policy for the city, as far as lot size, for example. And we did have some very clear changes to the ordinance for ADUs earlier this year, so that has changed, and that I don't think was reflected in that pull-out quote that was on page 3?
Page 11.
Not page 3. I'm sorry?
11.
Page 11. And so I echo the Mayor Pro Tem's concerns, but also thank you for the work. I think it provides us with an opening in the door to see where there are some issues that at the staff level. My comments are strictly directed to staff because the contact teams are volunteer organizations. It's really incumbent on us to make sure that they're operating properly. So I look forward to the additional conversation that we'll have going forward, and hoping that we can improve the process. Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts?
I just want to. It's going to change the, oops, my goodness.
Now you're on.
If it's going to change anything on the after January, because I put a lot of faith in the amendments that we did so that we could give the City of Austin staff more power over monitoring what's going on in the community with these contact teams, because if we don't stay on top of that, we're going to end up being in trouble when we do have Code Next and the Austin plan. When we implement all this change, and if we don't have the contact team on board, especially making sure that the neighborhood is participating in these contact teams, I think we're going to have some problems in coming here in the next year. So we really need to make sure that these contact teams are being represented by the neighborhood. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to thank my colleague, Councilmember Renteria, for your work in bringing that forward, and just reiterate that thank you for the work that you did in looking at the membership and the discrepancies. I think that really shows the need for just that kind of changes and ordinance changes. So thank you. Okay, all in favor? And that is unanimous with Vice Chair Troxclair off the dais. That is our last item, so we stand adjourned at 10:52. Thank you.
And it flows all over the world. River of Jordan, fountain of hope, take all our sorrow, wind like a rope through all of this heartache. Grant us a pardon, free us today.